Well, hello. How are you doing, everybody? Today we are going to be discussing something very exciting, something that I've been looking forward to quite a while. We're going to be looking at the themes, the characters, the story of Breaking Bad, which I think is appropriate to do given, it's been about 10 years since the end of the season, the series. And then just recently we've had the end of Better Call Saul. So this seems like a good time to return to Breaking Bad and discuss something which I think has been one of the best TV shows in a long time, and there's not loads which compares with it today. My guest today, well, uh, let me introduce him in a way that I hope he appreciates.
Now, say my name.
Apostolic Majesty.
You're goddamn right.
Well, thank you very much for that completely pertinent introduction. All I can say is I hope everyone doesn't suffer from some sort of audio whiplash going from an American accent to my rather dulcet English accent. But there you go. It is Walter White in the flesh. Hello.
Oh, it's great to have you here. It's great to have you here. And you, we were talking a bit about this a few months ago, and this was something that you were quite keen to do. That you've got quite a love for this show.
I mean, I enjoy it, which is a rare thing. I'm such a sort of nihilistic and a miserable person that when I actually enjoy something, it's a rare thing, and I hope to sort of latch on to those small moments of appreciation. But maybe it's a little confusing considering you and I have talked about the world, the legendarium of Tolkien, to go from Tolkien to talking about Vince Gilligan's own little sub-creation. Hopefully people can sort of understand why we're going to do that after this conversation.
Oh, I hope so. I hope so. And I think I think one thing just before we get going is I did a bit of reading about Vince's kind of views of Breaking Bad, and one of the things that he describes is that it's a world in which um, morality flavors all things, and actions have consequences. And to me, that very much connects it with the world of Middle Earth in a strange way. It's not a kind of absence of morality; it's brimming with it. I mean, it's in the very name, Breaking Bad, choosing bad or good. So I can see the appeal there or the connection. Am I stretching it too far?
I think the fundamental difference is that you're seeing this through the perspective of the baddies, so to speak.
Hmm.
But I mean, I'm sort of attached to the classic notion of the anti-hero, and I have a cold Machiavellian streak, so I can sort of appreciate actions when they're done intelligently, no matter sort of what morality they're in service of. So from that point of view, I find Walter White rather intriguing and all too human. And maybe it'll be interesting to talk about the development of the character of Walter White in particular, because that's where I would say I have most to say on this topic.
Oh, that'd be great. That'd be great. So, well, before we get into Walter White, is there anything you would like to promote?
Oh, no, I mean, I have a YouTube channel, but I think you've already linked it in the description, so thank you for that. But no, absolutely nothing to promote, just happy to be on.
Excellent. Well, just on my part, the opening music that everybody heard is by Hiya Love. I've been trying to promote him over the last few months. He's somebody in the DR who's making music. So I'd encourage everybody to go and support him and listen to some more of his music. So how this is going to work is I think the very beginning we're going to discuss the how Walter uh, enters in to the drug business. So there'll only be spoilers really for the first episode or first series there. Then we'll move into kind of his development within that and his relationships with various characters. So that will be kind of series 2 to 5. And then finally, we'll look at the end of the show. So if you haven't seen very much of it, because I know there's some people out there, you might. Yeah, I know some of you have only seen the first season, so you could stick around for a bit. But I'll let you know when we're kind of moving on from that if you want to avoid any spoilers. Though it has been out a decade, so uh, You've got to cut us some slack on that point. So to begin with, the kind of opening of the show, we meet Walter. He is a father of with a wife who's pregnant, with a son with cerebral palsy. He's a chemistry teacher, but he he's in quite a bad situation. They're financially not well off. They're struggling to make ends meet, uh, and then he gets a diagnosis of cancer, and he's going to have major medical treatment, which is going to cost lots of money. Additionally, Walt is a person who is highly intelligent. He's far too qualified to be a chemistry teacher at high school. He should be working on kind of Nobel Prize winning projects. And he was once in a company which he believes that he was involved with the starting up, and he feels he was pushed out of. So this is kind of the setting for which then Walter enters into the drug business. Um he hears from his brother-in-law, who's a bit of a kind of jock sort of character. He's been boasting about doing a drug raid, and he discovers that there's quite a lot of money in the drug business. And he during this a drug raid he attends, he sees one of his former students escaping, and he makes contact with this character to get into the development of meth. And Walter, being a great chemist, is able to develop one of the purest meths, if not the purest meth in the region, and that's how he's able to make money initially. So what do you kind of make of the setup for Walter?
Well, there's sort of two things I want to talk about. I have this theory that what Breaking Bad was supposed to be changed radically across the span of the series, because it starts up. I mean, it's almost like a sitcom intro, despite the fact how well paced the pilot is and how much is crammed in to that first. What is it? Is it now? I can't remember if it's just a standard length episode or slightly longer. But you relay so much. You find out that Walter White, played by Bryan Cranston, again, I think even the casting of Bryan Cranston, I think, reflects this, but it shows his range, that he was able to take the role and elevate it. But he's a terminal underachiever, and I mean that literally. You have images coming up at the beginning, you have degrees, you have contributor to the Nobel Peace Prize, and then you show him in his classroom, and he's asking people, his students, his disinterested public school class of 15, 16-year-olds, and he's asking, what is chemistry? And all his student can say is, chemicals, the study of chemicals. He's like, no, the study of matter. So even from that point, he's discussing these incredibly elemental concepts to people who do not care and do not respect him. And later on, you show him, in terms of reinforcing those money problems, he's working part-time at a car wash, which will later be a big thing later on in the series. And the Romanian owner is forcing him to wipe down cars, despite just normally being a cashier, and work overtime constantly. And he happens to be washing down the car of one of his students who, just completely disrespected him in his classroom. So all of this is just reinforcing the fact that Walter White had almost, infinite potential, and all of that is being squandered in some way or another. You brought up privately the idea of him being a gamma, and I find this interesting because you're familiar with sort of Vox Day content. He delineates sort of males into alphas, betas, gammas, and omegas, and a couple of characteristics he assigns to the gamma is, a perpetual liar, someone who's going to be incredibly disruptive to your organization. In some ways, yes, and also someone who has expertise, but also has this massive built-in inferiority complex. You could say in many ways that does sum up Walter White. There is an exception in the sense that he's not a total loser. And I think from the point of view of a comedy premise, if you didn't add this aspect to him, then his motivations wouldn't make any sense, because he has a wife, and his wife is also much younger than him. However, you try and underscore the fact that his situation isn't great when you add a son with multiple with MS. You also add the fact that the wife is pregnant and it was an accident at the same time. So money issues are incoming. He is unable to provide for his family. His wife isn't working at that time, Skylar. And, she has ideas about writing a series of children's novels, and that doesn't go anywhere. Maybe we can talk about the failed potential of Skylar's character. But all of this sort of emphasizes, from a comedy point of view, you can almost set it up. I can sort of imagine the trailer. He was your classic, unassuming high school chemistry teacher, but now he's going to cook crystal meth. And he brings in Jesse Pinkman, who is from Walt's point of view, he almost looks at him with some sort of mild admiration to find out that he's actually trying to apply some form of chemistry later on, even though, from a purely sort of scientific point, he's horrified by what Jesse's doing when he discovers him along that ride in. And all of these things bring us about. All of this is done very, very efficiently. All of this is done in the first pilot. And in the episode, he's introduced to the first drug dealer, and we're also introduced to the fact that the drug dealer is also a rat. He's ratted out Jesse's partner. The partner comes and believes Jesse is the rat and not the drug dealer. And in the very first scene, Walt not only breaks bad, not only does he enter into the drug business and try and use his former student to provide him those necessary connections, but the criminal reality of what he's doing is brought home by the fact that someone tries to murder him in the first episode, and he ends up killing someone in the first episode. And all of this also brings up the fact that he is now using his chemical brilliance, his encyclopedic knowledge of chemistry and his originality in chemistry to get him out of situations which anyone else would just fail and if Walt weren't a sort of exemplary chemist, he would have been killed over and over and over again. But he's capable of using his wits and his skill set to bring him out of the situation. So everything is set up about his character, what you need to know, but also I think the dark comedic premise from the beginning. And just to emphasize this, why I don't think the show was intended as a tragedy, he tries to kill himself in the first episode. He fires a gun. The gun had the safety on, so it doesn't fire. And then he turns the safety off and it fires after he tried to kill himself. So I think just little things like this emphasize, and you laugh, despite the fact that Walt just tried to kill himself after having murdered a drug dealer and after having Breaking Bad, made a confession tape to his family. All of this doesn't quite sit well. And yet all of these things, you can say almost inexplicably mesh to invite you into this world and conduct you down the next stage of this descent into the criminal underworld and the transformation of the character of Walter White from unassuming, mild-mannered, Clark Kent-esque chemistry teacher into the Heisenberg character, which he becomes at the end of season 1, in part.
I thought that was a beautiful summation of the first episode. The only thing I would add, and I appreciate some of this is from later episodes in season 1, is you mentioned respect being a key feature of Walt, and that at the school he's not respected by his students. You also see him not respected by his boss, essentially, like, oh, you need to go out. Even though he said that he wouldn't have to work on the car wash, he forces him to go out, treats him like dirt, essentially. But he's not respected by his family either. His son, rather than calling himself, so his son's called Walt Jr., but he takes this name Flynn. So there's this kind of, and Flynn looks up to his uncle Hank, this jock character, who's a detective in the drugs department of the police.
That reinforces. It's not just Walter Jr. But also, Walter Jr. is nothing like his father as well. And I think, there was an aspect, I think, with Walter Jr. where the series could have got a lot darker, but it didn't go there, I think, for PC reasons. But just regarding Hank is introduced, and you can almost say your stereotypical, almost un-American iteration of what people think American police officers and feds are. He's coarse, he's loud, he's vain. It's at Walt's 50th birthday party, and he has everyone sitting around watching him showing a drug raid and confiscating $700 million or something like that. So all of this again is to show that Walt is being eclipsed even by his own family on his own birthday at his own party, to just hone in the idea of reinforcing that idea that he isn't respected from all quarters, and people just expect him to be. I mean, he says this later, that I never feel that I'm in charge of my own decisions. Everyone is making decisions about my life, and he's just a silent partner. And the central theme, I believe, for Walt's character is a dead man walking, who, after his death diagnosis, decides to become alive again. And this is also sort of summarized with even the diagnosis. He doesn't want to go to hospital because he's worried about the insurance payments. When he arrives at hospital, you can almost say that, given the tragic comedy situation he's in, that the death sentence, again, the idea of being a terminal underachiever, well, this is just demonstrating that you are a perennial loser, that this almost seems a fitting end for you. I know in some sort of horrific Darwinian sense, he's almost embracing this and embracing this idea of oblivion. And he's so accustomed to failure after failure after failure after failure, that instead of actually focusing on the gravity of the situation, he's zoned out and he's focusing on a mustard stain on the coat of the doctor who's relaying to him this news. So we see a dead man walking, and now we're about to see the other personality of Walter White come out, which is the personality who is living vicariously to the detriment of others, which will manifest later in the season as Heisenberg.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because I'm reminded of a scene a bit in I think it's season 2, where Walt actually has to console Hank. Hank's been in a shootout, and he's quite a violent experience with his work, and he's kind of suffering trauma from this shell shock or whatever. And Walt goes in to talk to him, and he says, I've lived my whole life afraid of money problems, afraid of what people might say, what others will do. But when he got his cancer diagnosis, he slept soundly at night, that he realized that he's going to die. So what's the point of being afraid of these things? And actually the biggest enemy, he says, is the fear that he had. And so overcoming that fear, his death sentence freed him from that. And actually is it season 2, he discovers that he is in remission. There's a certain amount of anger to him, because it means he has to live with what he's been doing, whereas the promise of death almost allows freedom from thinking about those consequences, or living with what he is going to be doing.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I mean, that's also reinforced when the fact that he meets the younger man, I think just before his chemotherapy, and he's wanting to confide in Walt, and Walt just doesn't care. He's trying to, I can't remember exactly, I think it's in season 2, but he's saying, men make plans and God laughs, and he turns around and says, that's just complete bullshit. Every life comes with a death sentence. Every time I come in here, I know I could receive the news that I'm not going to make it much longer. But until that, who's in charge of my life? Me. So yes, it's a form of sort of emancipation in a way, which is rather confusing when talking about this in terms of strict morality.
I think so. And I mean, something maybe we'll get onto a little bit later is this idea, you can connect him with a sort of Nietzschean idea of throwing off the shackles of fear, or just following morality because you're afraid of the consequence of it, to pursuing your own desires. But I just wanted to come back to a couple of things before we move on, because we've mentioned kind of the rest of his family, but Skylar, I think it's important to say that she really doesn't respect Walt at this point. She, on his birthday, she kind of pleasures him while reading a magazine, so showing no interest in him, so adding to that comedic element, right?
Well, I mean, he's just sitting there completely uninterested. She's playing a game or whatever. I think she's actually trying to buy something on eBay, and that's the peak of his life. This is his special day. This is his special moment, and I think the way that she disrespects him comes in later when they're having that, silly intervention and they have the talking pillow or whatever.
Which was
And
her idea as well.
yeah, she wants everyone to get on board to confirm what she wants, which is that he takes the treatment regardless of how much it's going to cost, which is going to be like a horrific sum of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And as Walt is actually bringing around Hank and Marie, Skylar's sister, all of a sudden she angrily lashes out, "This isn't a discussion, this isn't a debate, you are going to take the treatment." So again, she's possessive over him. She controls him. I mean, to use a sort of coarse, a coarse analogy, she is wearing the pants in the relationship, and it shows. It comes through. I mean, even like at the beginning, you can't help notice that for a special sort of a birthday breakfast, he's given veggie bacon. So just little things like that. All of this is just to reinforce the fact that Walt is just pathetic. He's just a loser, and it's finding a way, finding that inner capacity, awakening something deep in him. And I think that before we sort of become very vague and nebulous, maybe it'll be sort of wise to sort of go into what happens and how Skylar and Walt react over the next couple of episodes, because the episodes then sort of take a break in terms of that rapid pacing, and they become very slow and very methodical. I think emphasizing the dark comedic aspects, because Jesse and Walt now have the situation that they have two bodies in the back, but oh no, one of them is still alive. So I don't know how they managed to make a comedy about chemical disincorporation and murdering someone, but they managed. I mean, you have Crazy Eight lumber out of the RV, the recreational vehicle, which is the mobile meth lab. I think what does Jesse call it? The sort of crystal ship or something like that. But anyway, Crazy Eight lumbers out, and you see a man who is sort of half dead just walking down the suburb trying to run away from Walter. And then Walter comes down in his car trying to sort of, say, come here, get in the back of the car. And then he runs away and goes straight into a tree. So again, just emphasize dark comedy. And then you have that moment later where Jesse is not listening to Walt about the particular container which he needs to put the body in, so the hydrochloric acid won't eat away. And so Jesse, in a consistent vein of ignoring Walt and again disrespecting him, puts him in the bathtub. And then you see this fantastic scene where the entire roof just collapses, and you have this horrific spool of guts and blood and acid dripping down into the basement, and it's shot like comedy, including comedic pause and just Walt talking about sorry, what were you asking me again about the stupid container or something like that. So it is remarkable, but they really slow everything down, and you don't know really where the series is going to go. And I think the moment where, in my mind, the series really sold me that it could elevate beyond just a dark comedy and become a character study and not just a thriller, but where Walter became very interesting in terms of his own sort of mental code. We see him almost childishly writing down, because Crazy Eight, the drug dealer who survives, is in the basement. He has like a bike lock around his neck, and you see these little moments of humanity where Walt is, giving him a sandwich, he's giving him, a pot to piss in, and water and stuff like that. And then he has this long conversation with him where they talk about how much of a small world it is in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The fact that the drug dealer worked in a local furniture store, and Walt would have bought the crib for Walter Jr. there. And for a moment, Walt goes back and you see these little scribbles saying, reasons not to kill. It's the wrong thing to do. I think he says the wrong thing to do twice, as if that's the extent of this chemical genius's capacity for the study of philosophy and ethics. And of course, my hated sort of description, Judeo-Christian values, etc., etc. And then against that, you just have the cold reality. If you don't, he'll kill you and your family. And so he's down there trying to convince himself, and Crazy Eight is trying to convince him, realizing that Walt is out of his depth, saying, you don't have to. I won't do anything against your family. I'll spare you. I'll even pay. I'll even pay for your treatment, etc. I'll write you a check now. And then you have a moment where he falls down. This is just before the conversation. He falls down due to his cancer. He has basically a blackout, and a plate crashes on the floor. He picks up all the pieces of the plate, and then he double checks again, goes through the bin, and finds out that there is a piece missing. And the realization dawns on him that after he's trying to humanize the man he's about to kill, after trying to find every moral justification not to do it and find an out from this business, he realizes that his prisoner is going to kill him the minute he releases, and has used every sort of trick in the book and every sort of means of trying to manipulate Walter into contriving this situation. And as Walter is holding on to the lock, next to the pole, which would ultimately suffocate him and do the deed, he's crying as he's doing it and trying to get a confession out of him. Once I let you out, are you going to stick that piece of plate in, stick me with that piece of plate? And then the drug dealer obviously realizes that his time is up. He needs to act quickly and try and kill Walter now. And Walt is forced to kill him in cold blood. And as he's killing him, and as the body collapses, he's just weeping and saying, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. But again, this is reflected in Walt's character, that he believes that he has no option at that point. He finds every sort of possible justification to not do it, and he's forced into a situation where he has to commit evil. And right from the beginning, there's the justification that everything I do is for my family. And by extension, if he let this crazy drug dealer loose, his family would be the subject of reprisals, not just him. So that is the moment, you can say, where Breaking Bad sort of elevates from this dark comedic premise, which, like I almost mentioned at the beginning, sitcom premise, where a frustrated, high school teacher with a cancer diagnosis goes out and teams up and makes drugs with his former pupil. Now it becomes, how far is Walt going to go in order to achieve this premise, in order to achieve financial security for his family? And what's it going to cost in the end? Because when you bring back to the character, Walt is ultimately disgusted from this. He doesn't want to go. Then he realizes that monetarily, and we'll talk about Gretchen and Elliot in a bit, monetarily, he's in a position where he's completely on his own, unless he accepts what he believes is charity. So rather than accepting charity, he decides to buy into this business again. And he says, this is the episode where he defines that he is Heisenberg. There will be no bloodshed. And this is a constant promise, again, going back to your point you made in private to me earlier, the idea that the Gamma is always lying. And he's always lying to himself at the same time. Even making that brief foray into the drug business, it's already had, catastrophic effects for him and the people around him. And this will just continue, and it'll worsen, and it'll exacerbate as things go on. But it starts here. And I think it's perfectly summarized in the first few episodes.
That's really well put, and I think you're right to draw attention to this idea that he essentially lies to himself as much as to others about the justification for doing these things. Although in the case that you raised, it's probably not a lie, right? Because if he lets Crazy Eight go, he probably will kill his family and him. So you maybe can see that what starts out as a truth ends up in later seasons as a justification which is losing its meaning and vitality. The money as well, you at the beginning, the money is required. He needs that money. And although Gretchen and Elliot, well, let's touch on that, because so Gretchen and Elliot, there's a lot of history with Walton and these two characters from when he was at university and engaged in these scientific projects. With Elliot, they started a company called Grey Matter, and they were going, that's what Walt's dream was, essentially. But he was also dating Gretchen at this time, Walt that is. But I see it's always a bit unclear. We see it from different characters' perspectives. Um, Walt feels that Elliot Elliot and Gretchen got together, and then he feels they pushed him out of the company. They then, discovering Walt's cancer diagnosis, Skylar told them without Walt's permission, offered to pay for all of his cancer treatment. So you've got this salvation for Walt. Essentially, his money problems could be solved, but he declines. Uh, in part, I think because he's a proud man, and he feels entitled to more in life, but also that as a man, as a father, as a husband, he should be able to provide for his family by himself.
I mean, this is the
That if
cornerstone
he
of
does,
his character,
mm,
because this whole idea is about his lost potential, and realizing this is not just lost economic potential, it's a recognition of prestige, personal achievement, and it's also romantic loss as well. Because I mean, you see it in the first phone conversation with Gretchen, where she's talking about the diagnosis. She's almost in tears talking to him. You know, her feelings are very extensive, and he can barely talk to her. So all of this is there, and it's sort of beautifully demonstrated and shown. And in terms of, you can say, the legacy, this brings back right at the end of the series where they reinforce this idea. The name of Grey Matter is the combination of their names. So Elliot Schwartz, Walter White, Grey Matter Technologies. And he later brings up in season 5, when talking to Jesse, that he's in the empire business. And what he means by this is that he believed in selling out his share of that company. He has sold out his children's birthright. So he almost has a dynastic conception of propriety, that I am building a dynasty and this will be my legacy. And I have to show it through these material things, these worldly achievements. And this comes back later, finally, when you have the episode of Ozymandias, etc. So it's quite an obvious theme that comes across as well. But all of this reinforces the idea that Walt believes he's cheated by these people. He's been denied what is rightfully his. And the monetary aspect, therefore, has to come from him. It has to be him demonstrating his own autonomy, his own power, his own prestige. And he's failed in this respect as Walter White. And he believes that the offering of charity of the health insurance given by Gretchen and Elliot is just a confirmation, that almost a recognition that he needs to accept that situation he's in, that whatever sort of dole or whatever he's going to get is going to be based on the charity, the affability of these two characters who he's come to despise and resent for cursing him in this situation. And so this recognition, I think, is more than just pride. It's almost a denial of self, that the final thing I will represent to my family is this leper attached to the legacy of people who have shut me out and eclipsed me.
it would have been totally humiliating for him, and again reinforcing him just as a loser. I think as well, this idea points to maybe another couple of genres that this show's tying into. You've mentioned this kind of dark comedy aspect to it. I think it's also a Western in a way. It's set in New Mexico, these wonderful desert scenes, and there's a sense of frontierism that Walter is out there to build, as you said, to build his empire, to
Yes.
stake his claim, to establish in a free land a place of his own, something that he can control and claim, as the kind of early Americans did. But at the same time, it's tied in with this idea of the American dream, but a frustrated American dream. I think you see this with something like Of Mice and Men, and I see this very much in that tone where, this is a guy who's doing everything by the book, and he can't get a break. His job's rubbish. He can't afford. He's being pushed out of a business he should have been a part of. The only way he can really succeed in America, the only place for him to build or to kind of define his life, is in the criminal underworld. And there's a sense then in which the show is kind of saying, well, look, in ordinary life, in American life now, it's almost impossible to have that frontier ambition that is at the heart of this country, and so it's being driven into this underworld, and you can see this, I think, with a number of characters who appear to be kind of upstanding citizens, but their wealth comes through uh, illicit means as well, such as Gus Fring, Ted Beneke, uh, and so there's this sense in which the show's kind of bringing these two things together and saying, look, this is actually, you can't build an empire in normal American life now. So if you want one, we're if you want if you're somebody like Walter White who's super intelligent and who has the ability to do such a thing, you're going to have to be um, going places where you shouldn't go. And what does that say about America?
That's a brilliant point, and I really want to emphasize this: the idea that this is ultimately a Western. How does one, cast a Western in the modern day? And you've said it. You have to descend into the criminal underbelly. In that sense, you can contextualize all of Walt's actions as the actions of someone on the frontier, that the morality is almost informed by the environment and he's in, and the necessity of survival when acting in that environment. And also you bring up this idea that, if anything, sort of material wealth in the Breaking Bad universe is associated with ill-gotten gains, with this frontier spirit, as of the case of the tax fraud with Ted Beneke and the inheritance, and the case with the secret drug empire of Gustavo Fring. So just a really important point, which I really think is key to emphasize, that this is a subversion of the Western trope, and I think that's why they picked this setting. But at the same time, it's almost trying to examine how that trope is realized and can exist within the modern world and within this context. And regarding Walt's character and the idea that, genius denied when playing by the rules, I think he brings up, I can't remember the name, but he brings up the example in one of his chemistry lectures about the man who invented the diamond, i.e. the artificial diamond with its, almost infinite sort of capacities in terms of engineering. And the fact that he was given I can't remember the exact amount, but a small savings bond, whilst everyone reaped the benefits from his creation. And again, that sort of, he obviously finds parallels with him, and he almost gets emotional when talking about this, to the point that everyone is just stunned into silence, because that is very much his own sort of feeling regarding his patents pending for grey matter technologies, that it is these great men who are being overtaken and taken for a ride in this world, and that one has to become the outlaw in order to get ahead. And that's what Walter becomes.
Well, I mean, what it was the original promise of America, or how was it sold? Go to this land, work hard, and make your fortune. In this bureaucratic world where you need to pass so much regulation, where there's all these monopolies in place, the only situation where there is upward mobility, where a poor man like Walter or Gus Fring, who doesn't start out as a rich man, can end up wealthy and making their fortune, is in this underworld. Even somebody like Jesse Pinkman, who he's not particularly talented at the beginning. He's a decent cook of meth, but he's not, brilliant. He's a bit of a loser. Through hard work and a bit of tutelage, he can make his fortune too. He made something of himself. So that, whereas in ordinary society, somebody like Jesse is basically cut out. There's nowhere for him to go. He tries to get a job at one point, and the only thing he would be able to do is hold a sign outside a store. And that might be good for somebody, but he's obviously somebody with a bit of talent to himself, but he can't get any work.
There's a lot of character development for both Jesse and Walt, and the sort of the next, after the disposal of the body and the murder of Crazy Eight, is basically parallel lives. You see Walt interacting with Gretchen and Elliot, and for Jesse, you see him after this, very depressing sort of act, coming back to his family, and crawling over the fence and landing in the patio furniture, and then very reluctantly taking him back, only for and of course being presented with the ideal sort of child who he never was in the form of his brother. And then you see later that his brother is actually smoking pot, and Jesse takes the rap for it, and of course, earns the sort of total separation from his family, which will never be resolved, even in the epilogue El Camino. But all of this sort of sets up the fact that you're right. Jesse really does have nowhere to go. He tries to apply, very earnestly, for a job as a salesman, and he can only be one of those walking advertisements, etc. So both Walt and Jesse realize that their only sort of recognition of self-worth, in many respects, that achieving autonomy for themselves, or if I'm going to be really trite, self-actualization, ironically, is achieved through the cooking of crystal meth. So they're at the same time terrible for each other, and yet at the same time they're also made for each other. They benefit each other, and they also destroy one another.
Well, and in part, I think, although at the beginning Jesse doesn't fully respect Walt, he will always call him Mr. White. Throughout the series, he refers to Walt as Mr. White. So he does seem to have a level of respect of Walt as like a teacher to him. He always maintains that sort of superiority in relation to Jesse. And throughout the series, Walt comes to see Jesse. I think in one episode, he talking to somebody else, he describes him as a nephew or something like that. So there's this very strong kind of paternal relationship.
Well, I mean, son.
The
The
son,
idea
yeah.
of him being a son. I mean, there's even that moment later on where Walt is being knocked out, and he's talking, semi-intoxicated to his son, and he says, that's right, Jesse.
Mm.
Talking to Walt as Jesse. So I think this idea of this is why I bring up Walter White Jr. and the lost potential and this idea of dynasty, because I do believe, in a sense, that Walter White is not only wanting the monetary situation of his family to be assured, but he also wants to pass on his learning. He can't achieve that through his son, and he won't be able to achieve that through his daughter because he'll be long dead before she's at that stage. So weirdly, Jesse, out of nowhere, is that sort of represents that need for him, but also that need, you can almost say, to go back to academia and professorship, the idea of like a PhD tutor and a PhD student. I know that sounds a bizarre sort of analogy, but when we're talking about, the most chemically pure crystal meth in existence, I think it's fair to say this is this is a business relationship. This is a familial relationship, but this is also effectively like a guild relationship, the master mason passing on his craft, and in that way Walt will survive through Jesse.
And there's this constant sense throughout that Walt, he's not only training Jesse, in some sense he needs Jesse because he's given the opportunity to have other apprentices, as it were, other people supporting him, people who are more qualified, such as Gale, who himself is a quite brilliant chemist. But it's that relationship where Jesse. Well, I find it difficult to put my finger on because it's not just that he learns from him. It's the fact that Walt can humiliate Jesse in some ways as well. That
Well,
he can really
berate
dress him
him,
down.
destroy
Yeah.
him, break him down, disassemble his arguments, and it really has an effect on Jesse because
Hmm.
Jesse is not sure of himself. Jesse doesn't have a clear set of opinions, not just talking about the chemistry, but talking about the management of the business and life. And I really want to save this and bring this point back because it really reinforces the idea at the end of the series and why their relationship breaks down so catastrophically. But just think about this, the idea that Walt is he's a better manipulator. In that sense, he is able to constantly trying to redefine and persuade subtly Jesse into committing certain things, even without Jesse's knowledge. And of course, the art of manipulation is to be able to imprint an idea into someone and make it seem like it's their own idea. And Walt does this repeatedly with Jesse and subtly moves him towards him. And at the end, Jesse is just, he's aware of this. He's aware of this, yet he can't quite escape it. There is this sense where he is completely dependent on this idea that he's susceptible to these mind games. And to the extent that you can argue, is the paternalistic relationship genuine? I believe it is. Yet at the same time, there is this Stockholm Syndrome-esque abusive relationship angle to all of it to ensure that they remain a couple and they continue plodding along and enterprising in the meth industry.
Let's move forward to maybe how Walt builds his empire with Jesse. So we're kind of moving to the end of season 1 onwards at this point. And initially, they're developing the meth with the signature blue touch because of the various chemicals that were required to make it. They had to find a certain chemical that they could use.
Yes, at the beginning, they start off making a pseudo cook.
Mhm.
And afterwards, when pseudo is basically run out, they have to acquire methylamine. And I think it's a P2P cook. And there's another comical scene where they're robbing a warehouse with the methylamine, and they use what was it? What is the powder they use? I forget exactly, but again, Walt is demonstrating his chemistry smarts and being able to break into this control facility. But then you have little moments like they're just huddling along, holding this barrel rather than rolling it, and Hank basically observes this and just laughs as they watch the CCTV footage, as one of the security guards is locked in one of the portable loos outside trying to get out. So there are all these little moments that come through, but this is where Walt is able to perfect and create his signature formula, which is the blue formula, thermite. Yeah, someone in the chat has just mentioned thermite, and again he comes up with this World War II analogy again to be able to bring the audience along with what exactly he's achieving here. So Walt at the same time is representing his versatility, yet in the way that Hank, even without knowing it, is still mocking Walt, shows that he still has a long way to go. And this is, I think, where we get to the end of season 1. And we talk about the Heisenberg moment, because now Crazy 8 is out. They're cooking meth. It also should be pointed out in terms of reinforcing this necessity of the two, i.e. them sort of mutually reinforcing each other, some sort of weird symbiosis between Jesse and Walt. Jesse tries to cook with, what's his name, Badger, Brandon Mayhew. And that turns out to be a total disaster. And Jesse actually leaves him in the middle of the desert and drives off. So when they come back, Jesse is trying to sell this new concoction to a member of the Salamanca family, who are going to be a series of recurring characters through Breaking Bad. And in particular, one Tuco Salamanca, who is represented as one of the top drug dealers in the state. He introduces the drug to Jesse. Jesse introduces the drug to Tuco. Tuco is very impressed with it, but he also uses at the same time. So he's high as a kite. There's one comment, and all of a sudden he's beating Jesse to a pulp. So now this paternalistic instinct kicks in, but also this idea that Walt, by proxy, has also been attacked, because Tuco has not only attacked Jesse, his adopted son, but he's also attacked the Enterprise. And here Walt comes out, he shows his face, he dons the famous hat, and he is able to win Tuco's respect by almost blowing up his compound. What was it in particular? I think some sort of compound of mercury he was able to use to affect this explosion, which isn't
Well, and just say it looked very much like meth.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So he was able to use his intelligence to smuggle in something that looked like crystal meth, and someone is mentioning in the chat fulminated mercury, and but also in terms of his brilliance, he's able to accomplish an explosion which shocks everyone, sets off all the car alarms in the area, doesn't draw the police, interestingly enough. Maybe they know not to go around that area, but it shocks Tuco into submission. and now Walt has the upper hand. And this is not Walt as Walt. This is Walt, first of all, donning the identity of Heisenberg. So in contrast to Jesse, who has been humiliated and hospitalized, Walt has finally achieved respect, but he's achieved it not as Walter White. He's achieved it as the Werner Heisenberg character. So I think that's fascinating in the sense that he achieves this level of respect by appealing to, you can say, the base instinct in his character, this wanting to exist, this desire for recognition. Yet at the same time, he's also doing it through his vast skill set at the same time. So this is Walter White, but it's not Walter White. It is a much darker, but also liberated version of Walter White.
Yeah, it's he's overcome that fear. Vince Gilligan even said, Walter, after his cancer diagnosis, is a man of action. He's got agency within this underworld that he's able to confront. Somebody who's pretty terrifying. Tuco is a terrifying character who's just beaten up his partner, who, for all intents and purposes, knows the drug world far better than Walter. And he's able to go in there with, balls of steel, essentially, and outthink and out-intimidate this character. And this seems to be, you could see this as a kind of, Walter has put off in this underworld the fear which made him follow the rules or be obedient. That he's just pursuing his desire in that case, but he never quite fulfills it because, as you say, it's only within this underworld that comes through. He does try to exert it. It breaks forth in his family life at various points. So, for example, there's a party to celebrate Walter's remission,
but just before that,
go ahead.
That's late into season 2, or maybe even the beginning of season 3. I can't quite recall, but there are these moments where the character breaks out, and it really does seem like night and day, because in the very first episode there are a few bullies mocking Walter White Jr. And Walt simply comes in through another entrance and kicks and beats up the leader of this gang and intimidates him to basically run away. Later on, you're introduced to this shyster, this stockbroker or some other sort of city iteration who's walking around very loudly on a speakerphone, whatever. And it's a character who's established that Walter absolutely despises. He's a horrific specimen. Then Walter sees him again at a petrol station, at a gas station. And with no one looking, in broad daylight, in the middle of the city, he sabotages his car and it blows up in the middle of a gas station. There's no reason for him to do this. This is just, I'm alive. I want to commit these acts, and he does it. And again, this isn't just the Heisenberg. This isn't just the drug character. This is just, you could say, the repressed Walter White coming out in all of these unexpected moments and affecting change in the real world, albeit it's petty, sporadic, and tribal almost.
Well, you also have in his sex life a change, because as we were joking earlier about, Skylar trying to buy something on eBay while pleasuring him. He comes home after, I think it's after the incident with Tuco.
It's in the pilot, actually.
Oh, it's in the pilot.
It's in the very first episode. He comes back after just having cleaned up the partial destruction of the RV and taken the bodies back to Jesse's house. And he comes back and rather dramatically has sex with Skylar. And this is repeated often. I think there's even an episode where he's pleasuring her at a PTA meeting, at a parent-teacher association, underneath the table as they're all talking, because Hank is onto Walt at the beginning. He doesn't know it's Walt, but he's following up like his mirror throughout the entire series. And he finds out that the chemical equipment came from Walter's chemistry lab. And later, the janitor there is arrested because he has a marijuana connection. But later on, they're having sex in the car. And Skylar is like, where did that come from? And why was it so good? And Walt's saying it's because it was illegal. So there is this visceral, impact that this has on him, this idea that he's now living, he's not simply waiting for death. And it's very much reflected in the final sort of confession he makes to Skylar, where he says, she's about to hear his spiel again, that I did all of this for the family. And he says, I did it for me. I liked it. I was good at it. And I was alive.
I think that's key. Like you've mentioned, this is the repressed Walter White coming out. There can be this illusion that because Walter was mild-mannered, that he was a good character in the beginning that went bad. But to me, he didn't kind of turn bad. That badness was always there. He was just afraid of letting it out, and he's a more admirable character for acting upon how he feels.
That's bizarre, isn't it? I mean, he's not a good man at the beginning. He's a coward. He's a loser, and he's a coward.
He was very bitter about that.
And this is the actualization of his character, not necessarily the transformation into a new character. If anything, we could have seen this hypothetical where he doesn't sell out his share and he becomes, a ruthless CEO, corporate head, etc., or whatever. Or it could manifest in so many iterations. It just happens in the environmental circumstances of that time. It was manifested as Walter White, the drug lord.
Indeed. And I mean, I think that raises the question of then, is Walter genuinely an everyman? Because he appears as such at the beginning, just a standard guy working his job or whatever. And I know it's quite common to say, well, the heart of the evil dwells in every heart. The line between good and evil is there, and anybody could end up like Walter. But part of me thinks, well, actually, I'm not sure if that's true. I'm not sure if most people could end up like Walter. I think there was a real darkness in him that may have been particular to him, because even if some people thought, well, okay, I need to make some money, there seems to be all this other stuff in there that, the thrill of the illegality. Well, maybe that's there for a lot of people to a certain extent, but it goes to dramatic extents with Walter.
Yes, but it's not. Yeah, it's not just the thrill of illegality. I mean, in one sense, you could say that in the first series, this really comes across. There is a moment of adolescent rebellion where he is breaking the rules for the sake of breaking the rules, and he enjoys it. Even from they comment on this when he's smoking pot, and he makes this false confession, semi-false confession to Skylar, and they're all sort of mocking him like he's 16, etc. And Skylar is bringing him down again. And another comedic scene where she comes around and berates Jesse and says, "Don't sell pot to my husband," whilst there's a body just just behind her. She's standing there, a comedy shop with the body just lying behind her, and she's completely oblivious. But that sort of moment of adolescent rebellion, these tendencies to just commit illegal acts because of the rush. Later on, it's the coalescing of this rush, this will to power, this Nietzschean will to power within Walter White, with the hard realities of the acquisition of power. And this is why I believe that Walter isn't an everyman, because Walter is a genius. He's not just a chemical genius, but he's also a brilliant strategic mind as well. He's the equal, and ultimately he surpasses Gus Fring. And you can say that if Gus Fring had, faults, his principal fault was continually underestimating Walter White. And Walter White was ultimately able to supplant him and in many ways eclipse him. And he brought down his downfall. You can say it's not necessarily this poetic idea that pride comes before a fall. You could say that his fall comes as a result of a brief oversight, an accident, and he also happened to have the most tenacious possible antagonist in the form of his own brother-in-law, who was just on a moment on Hank. What I like about Hank is that he's like a realistic version of Columbo. if that makes sense. Columbo, but actually existing in the real world, because his suspicions are built on very flimsy evidence, but his instincts are correct. And I think, in the sense, he knows someone's out there. He knows there's, a new player. I mean, and again, comedy. There's this scene where he's talking about Operation Icebreaker. He finds the pure crystal meth. He's talking about, Albuquerque might have a new kingpin, and it just edits to Walt in the bathroom, swirling around his mouthwash. So again, it's just both characters are, again, like Jesse and Walt and Hank are feeding off each other. Walt is building the empire, but the construction of the empire also gives Hank his motivation to effectively remain a member of the DEA within Albuquerque, because he's given an opportunity twice to leave and directly deal with the Juarez clan on the Mexico border in Texas, El Paso. And he refuses this because of his obsession to get to the source and find Heisenberg. And again, the irony being that, Walt is Heisenberg, and it's only once Walt has achieved, total power, walked away from it, only then does Hank realize who Heisenberg really is.
Well, and just to that point, with Hank, there's a part where he's quite injured after a shootout, and he just has no motivation in life anymore. He's confined to his bed. He becomes obsessed with minerals and very distant from his wife Marie, who up until that point, they've got on quite well, I think, compared to Walter Schuyler. They seem like a decent relationship. But it's when he starts to kind of reignite his interest in Heisenberg again that suddenly he's out of bed, he's back out into the world.
Yeah.
His relationships are restored. Him and Maria back together, strong. And you're right that really is his purpose in life, was to find Heisenberg. Without it, he's a shell of a man.
Just to emphasize this, I believe he was virtually suicidal
Yeah.
without Heisenberg. I mean, there is a trope in a lot of modern media which is emphasizing the PTSD trope. But beyond that, just for Hank, because it's clear that he is going through some sort of PTSD after El Paso, and after, even before then, when he shoots Tuco. If anything, I think it's to give his character the semblance of depth, because before then he's characterized as this, meathead, gun-toting idiot. I think there's even like one joke where he says, does the Pope shit in his hat, etc. Just every sort of, coarse, exclamation you could imagine, he's there, but again, reinforcing the idea that this is meant to be a comedy. El Paso sort of brings out a side in Hank, which, adds complexity to that, but also his horrific treatment of Marie, it should be mentioned, because Marie is absolutely devoted to him. At the beginning of the series, it's seen that Marie is the despicable character, the judgmental kleptomaniac, and he is tolerant of that. He moves around that, and Hank is shown to be a rather sort of liberal sort of again, the sort of anything sort of adds complexity to his character. The fact that he is not cross with Walt Jr. for trying to buy liquor illegally. Instead, he's angry because he believes it's disrespecting Walter at the same time. Again, there are these subtle nuances that become more pronounced, and by season 3, we have this moment where he's been shot, he's been incapacitated, he believes is useless, and he's taking it out almost violently on Marie, and only when Walt basically gives him this impetus, this idea that maybe Heisenberg's still out there after, Gale's murder by Jesse, does he have the will to live all of a sudden again? And suddenly his relationship with Marie is much better. So yes, I do believe it is, ironically, his will to live, and without it, he is left depressed and near suicidal.
So let's kind of move the plot along a little bit here, because we've kind of talked about things, but we're still kind of just at the end of season 1. So Walt gets this deal with Tuco, but the next time they meet with Tuco, he again is high and kills one of his associates. And this convinces Walt and Jesse that they need to kill Tuco, that they're going to get killed if if because Tuco didn't realize he killed this person, and so they believe that he'll think that they've ratted him out or ratted out the death of this person to
Well,
the
there's
police.
also the fact that his other henchman accidentally gets killed when he's moving the body and gets crushed by
Crushed by the car.
and bleeds out. And Hank shows him this. Again, it's weird that there's a symbiotic relationship between Hank, in the sense that Walt uses his relationship with Hank and his access to information via Hank to be able to keep one step ahead. And in this case, he gets the information from Hank that I think it's Gonzo is dead. And after that, the police are on to Tuco, and Tuco rounds them up, and basically he goes around, he hunts Jesse, shows up at Walt's flat, and takes him to a tiny little bungalow, a shed effectively near the border, wanting his cousins to go and pick him up. And here Jesse and Walt have to achieve many things. First of all, they need to survive. They need to escape. Tuco is clearly unhinged in believing that these people would willingly allow themselves to be kidnapped and basically sold as slaves out in Mexico. The only sort of person who's privy to the plan, of course, because we also introduce Hector Salamanca, who is the old drug cartel lieutenant enforcer, who is also incapacitated. He can only communicate using a bell, and not necessarily even to say yes or no. And other members of the cast are able to interact with him more successfully than others. So he has one sort of overriding philosophy, which is family is everything. He is fiercely loyal to his nephew Tuco, and he tries to save Tuco to no avail. They get out, there's a brief fight, and this is where, because of course Walt has been kidnapped, who's gone to look for him? Hank. Hank finds Tuco in trying to look for Jesse Pinkman's car, therefore finding Tuco unexpectedly. There's a shootout. Tuco is killed, but how, Jesse and Walt can't just say, hello, Hank, thank you for saving us, because then it would ask too many questions. So they have to go AWOL. And in order to try and justify his absence, Walt basically streaks off in the middle of a supermarket to imitate a fugue state of a temporary sort of mental absence. And this is where this sort of relationship between him and Skylar really broken down. I mean, we haven't talked that much about the relationship with Skylar, but Skylar is shown right from the beginning. It's not a developing pattern for her, and I think this weakens the character. Skylar is shown right from the beginning to be overbearing and insufferable. I'm sorry, I'm just going to say it. In the sense that she hears one weird phone call and, calls back and finds out the number. She then researches this. She then pushes Walt on it, even though she has no real grounds for any sort of suspicion up to this point, other than the fact that Walt's being a little bit quiet. And goes and tells Jesse, stop selling pot to my husband, because, Walt gets around it by saying that. And this sort of doesn't sort of let up throughout all of this. She's constantly worried where he's going all the time. And this is where he finally sort of announces to her, I have cancer, believing that this excuse and all the sort of, worry associated with it and long walks are an explanation to get around this. But this is where all of this is tested to the limit, because he answers from his second cell phone. He goes outside and he's kidnapped. So he has to explain this. All of these questions are still sort of whirling around in Skylar's mind. And he basically convinces his psychiatrist to let him out of the situation, explaining that I effectively ran. He didn't explain that, no, I'm a drug lord on the run and I was kidnapped, but enough to allow him to leave hospital and to give Skylar some explanation. But again, all of these things are unanswered for her, and their relationship isn't going to be resolved until she believes she has been let in. And when she is let in, it destroys their relationship. In season 3, because right at the beginning we talk about his situation with cancer. season 1 and season 2 are very important when it comes to a cancer. Season 1, he's got a death sentence. Season 2, he's given a second lease of life. He receives very effective medical treatment. He goes for an operation. The operation is successful. And right at the moment where he has that extra lease of life, where he also believes that he has earned enough money through an intensive cooking session. I think it's something like $700 million worth of potential meth, which he's given to Jesse. It looks like everything is good. If he were to die at that moment, which, he sorely hoped, everything would have been achieved. Instead, he survives and everything begins to fall apart because Skylar, like an investigator, goes back and picks up all the pieces and finds out that nothing really makes any sense, that he's been lying consistently for the last 2 seasons. She has no idea what it is. And at the beginning of season 3, she finally understands that, he's a drug dealer, and he confesses to her. And this leads to a sort of moment where, because he has received this new lease of life, he doesn't know what to do with it. He's destroyed his family situation. His wife hates him. His son still doesn't know. But he's, in theory, made enough money. He can't find a way to get it to them. So despite all of the progressions in his character, despite everything he has done, he is really back at square one. If anything, he is the lowest at any point up until the end of the series, because is reinforcing this idea that he's disrespected. And he tries, to present it to Skylar. I've earned the money. I've earned all this money. It's it's basically an entrepreneurial exercise. I think he almost tries to justify it to her. And what does she do? She has already sort of gone and taken a job, I think, to get away from this. She had a previous sort of, it's not sort of explicitly mentioned, but it's sort of implied that Ted Beneke had already, hit on her when she used to work there. But she goes back to this company called Beneke Fabricators. And after Walt makes this justification to her, which he almost feels is his triumph, he's being able to overcome all of these limitations, and he's been able to actually make something of himself. But of course, it's a drug empire. So what does she do? She takes out revenge on him and sleeps with her boss. And it ultimately, sets him back at at square one. He's been destroyed, and his wife has tried to demonstrate in no uncertain terms that not only that I hate you, but I reject everything that you have done, ostensibly to help the family.
Well, and just before she joins, before she sleeps with Beneke, she did file for, presented with Walter, you must leave the house, we must get a divorce, you're not going to get to see the kids.
Yes.
He then, I think it's early in season 3, he decides, no, I'm going to come back. And he asserts himself. He asserts his agency again, that I am the father, I am the husband, I'm going to stay here. And he calls her bluff because she threatens to hand him in. But he realizes, I think with the advice of Saul Goodman, who is his lawyer, who's helping him facilitate his new empire, that she won't do this because it will destroy her children.
Yeah.
And having a dad who was a drug dealer and bring them into disrepute. So he calls her bluff, but this is the only way she feels she can get back.
Well, I mean, it's worse than
by
that.
hurting his pride.
She literally calls the police on him. They come and storm in the house, and she's given the option where the police officer is basically begging her to confess some sort of knowledge of criminal activity, and she won't do it. So she pushes it that far, and Walt is that convinced that she won't do it. And you're correct. And this is, like I said, it's, an ultimate act of sort of the active destruction of their relationship. Walter's, ironically, in his disturbed way, is trying to save their relationship, at least in his mind. And he sort of says over and over again, I'm happily married, despite the fact that they're not talking to each other at all and have no sort of possible sort of point of connection over this issue. He tells himself, almost because it's his reason to exist, I'm happily married. And she goes out of her way to destroy the relationship and reject everything that he has done.
Well, and in that respect, it's interesting, the name of Ted's company, Fabricator, they're both liars here. And she has, as you said, had the moment to confess. She doesn't, so she's she's taken the bad route in that situation, and she has to live with that throughout the rest of the series. And eventually, she comes to actually be complicit in Walt's activities too, processing the money for him when they buy a garage that they can funnel the money through.
But also, it's worse than that. She's not only, I mean, because you've already brought it up with the name of the company, the Fabricators. Not only is she complicit in the crimes of her husband, she's now made complicit in the crimes of her lover at the same time. So she has a penchant for pathological liars, it would seem. But I think that's as much as I sort of want to talk about Skylar for now, and to just rounding up on season 2, I think, because we missed out a lot, especially when it comes to Jesse. Just to give a brief overview. So we have the death of Tuco, we have the fugue state, we have them surviving the kidnapping. Jesse is pressed quite hard by the DEA, that and his prostitute Wendy, and both of them come out. They're not imprisoned, and Jesse relies on his old cabal of friends. What's his name? We have Badger, we have Skinny Pete, and we have what's his name? Combo. And they form this ragtag sort of new gang within Albuquerque, and they're not really getting anywhere. They're not really making any serious money. And this is where Saul Goodman is introduced, when one of the dealers, Badger, is caught. He's manipulated into giving away the information. And this sort of really demonstrates the fact that they are absolute beginners. Despite all the horrible things that have happened, they haven't made any money. I think even Saul is horrified about this when it's the second episode where he's introduced, because he's impressed with their product. He wants to sort of be a part of that. But at the same time, he almost gave Walter White a bit more credit when it came to his previous business acumen. He asked how much money you've got. I think he sort of mocks him that you've left your family a secondhand Subaru in terms of the amount of money that he's produced. So the second season is trying to get a footing for the drug empire. And after starting with Tuco, who was, just the bomb waiting to explode, Saul, through his connections, is able to introduce Walt to Gustavo Fring. We don't know anything about him at this point. We're simply shown that he is the owner of a local fast food chain called Los Pollos Hermanos, the Chicken Brothers. At the same time, Jesse is having a sort of complete sort of mental collapse, because as a result of this ill-fated drug operation where Walt and Jesse were, in charge, Jesse has been able to, trying to force the idea of, his own street cred through the accidental death of a man called Spooge, where his wife had crushed his head in with an automatic sort of money dispensing machine. That was enough to sort of give them enough street cred for a small amount of time, up until a point where they started, again, Walt and his ambition, pushing into new territory. After which, one of the drug dealers, one of Jesse's close friends, Combo, is killed by a child acting on orders of a drug gang, which is later revealed to be part of Gustavo Fring's organization. He begins to go back to using meth at this point. And also he brings in his girlfriend, Jane, into this, who has also had a history with drug use and drug abuse. They both sort of go downhill together. She introduces him to heroin. We're introduced to the father, who is played by Q from Star Trek. I just need to bring that up. One of my favorite characters from Star Trek: The Next Generation. And all of this is a recipe for not just, Jesse's sort of demise, but his death as well. Because when they finally achieve, what they wanted to achieve this entire time, which was the deal of a lifetime with Gustavo Fring and selling the meth that they had made earlier in the series, Jesse is completely out of his mind on heroin. Walter has to actually break into his flat and steal the crystal meth. And then Jesse has essentially no idea what's happening, but then, of course, Jane finds out what's going on, blackmails Walt to give him his half of the operation, which would have been about $500,000. They are both incredibly sort of into the drugs at that point. So the question is now a moral question from Walt. It's, it's effectively like Plato's axe. In giving him the money, he believes that he's going to essentially kill Jesse because they're just going to waste the money on, a death-inducing supply of drugs. But Walt ultimately decides that he has no option because she is threatening to contact the police and contact the local media. Then we have the infamous moment, which I think really tries to enforce this idea of the knock-on effects of Walt's moral actions throughout the series. Throughout the series, there had been visual reminders to what will happen at the end. Foreshadowing, for lack of a better word. Where you see the eye of a little pink bear in the pool. You constantly see these little reminders and little prologues before episodes. And they become sort of more apparent that I think it's even at the beginning of the last episode where you see smoke and you see debris falling from the sky. As it so happens, Walt comes back, and after he's just given them the money, and to his horror, they are both, again, completely out of their mind on heroin. However, accidentally, he has pushed Jane over to the point that she is lying flat when, of course, there is the concern that they're going to choke on their own vomit during the night, and she does. Walt has the option to save Jane, and he decides to let her die, believing that by doing that, he would effectively save Jesse because he has robbed her of her negative influence. If anything, it's a way of also reclaiming Jesse because, the father and the girlfriend effectively bringing him back in under his influence. And he even says this when there's a chance interaction with Q. I actually do know what is right for you. There is that possessiveness. There is that very active paternalism. And it leads him to acquiesce in the murder, the death of Jane, the accidental death of Jane. And the knock-on effect of the accidental death of Jane is the depression of her father, Q, who is also an air traffic controller. And it is said that through his own accident as an air traffic controller, 2 planes crash into each other above Albuquerque, resulting in hundreds of people dying and debris falling from the sky like hellfire. So, yeah, I think in trying to quickly sum up season 2, I think that's the best I can do.
You did a remarkable job, I must say. I think I think it as you say, it really highlights that there are no cost-free actions within this world. Walt seems to have this continual idea, as you mentioned earlier, that there'll be no harm done by what he's doing, that he will be able to get away with it. Not just in terms of his own, he will get away from the authorities, but also that people won't be hurt by this. But you've already mentioned one of the key examples was the man Spooge having his wife absolutely high on drugs, who kills him with an ATM machine, and these two are, I think, a foreshadow of what may happen to Jesse and to Jane if they
Yes.
if they go away.
I think that's a very good point. I think the only thing that would reinforce that, because it reinforces that idea for the audience, but would have Walt actually witness that, because instead you have Walt conniving to manipulate that fact to build up Jesse in the minds of not only the buying public, but also in terms of his own enforcers, until it's ultimately dispelled. But yes, I think that's a very good point. As for season 3, I would say season 3 is probably the weakest season of Breaking Bad, because season 1 is very compact and introduces
wait a second. I have something to play because that is an outrageous statement. Let's see.
Explain yourself.
Okay, you can go.
Fantastic. Season 2 does a very good job of creating a central arc for the season in the sense of the unintended consequences of Walt's actions. We've already seen it with Combo, we've seen it with the death of Jane, and we've seen it with the plane crash. With season 3, we have Walt at his lowest point, like I said, meandering after this faux achievement, and Skylar trying to, torpedo the relationship after finding out what's happening. At the same time, Jesse is in rehab and he comes that realization that I'm the bad guy. And a lot of the early part of the season is focusing on the fact that Walt will not come to terms with reality. He is in a state of denial, and he is constantly lying over and over again to himself. And it's only through, you can say, a recognition of reality that, if anything, he is best served through participation in this, that he almost sort of drops the pretense anymore, because he says again and again that, I'm not the bad guy. I'm not a criminal. And he even says this to Gustavo Fring when they meet, no offense to people who are, etc., etc., etc. We also see some sort of
Just before you move on to that point, just remember though that this is a character whose actions have led to one of the worst plane crashes in history,
and it begins the
and he
season
can't like yeah.
exactly. Well, the season begins with him trying to justify his actions in some sort of horrific school sort of emotional outpouring auditorium at the beginning. Then he's talking to Jesse how, actually, no, I blame the government. It was the system's failure. I had nothing to do with it. There are all of these contingencies, one of which failed. I'm sorry, in fairness to Walt, that's probably true. But at the same time, it is a great level of mental gymnastics to try and explain the fact that actually, no, he had no indirect effect resulting in this. And I think the greatest sort of demonstration of the fact that he is, completely full of bullshit is the fact you almost have the angels of death incarnate, sent on him during this season, which are the Tuco cousins, who come after him as a result of some sort of a cartel vendetta for the death of Tuco, which they believe Walt was responsible for betraying Tuco, which isn't true. Because of course, he was kidnapped by Tuco in the first place, so Tuco really, forced that situation on Walt. But nevertheless, it exists within the mind, and I think again, it's one of these moments visually where it transcends, the actual sort of nitty gritty in terms of the raw information which brings Tuco into conflict with Walter. Rather, it is almost seen as this divine retribution on the figure of Walter, and so we have the figure of a guardian angel for Walt in the form of Gustavo Fring, who prevents the assassination, but then redirects the assassins to attack Hank. And so by extension, Walter is responsible for the attack on Hank as well, and the near fatal shootout. But I think it's important to step back and explain what on earth is going on, because we've talked about this from the character point of view, but I think this is rather blinkered in terms of not understanding the power play. Gustavo Fring becomes the sort of main sort of facilitator of Walt, but later the antagonist towards the end of the series. Gustavo Fring is an unassuming restaurateur within New Mexico and several other states in the American Southwest. It is later revealed that he has extensive connections with the cartel, and later will be revealed in season 4 that he has quite a lot of beef with the cartel. Nevertheless, he has influence enough to sway the cartel to protect Walter White, because we later find out that his own chemist, Gustavo's own chemist, Gale, has basically said that if you want the best of the West, you have to go for Walter White. I won't give you a product of sufficient quality. So he, despite the fact that they have a rocky relationship to begin with, Gus is protecting Walter White for his own business interest. And he sees in this a possibility, a strategic possibility of cutting the cartel out of services north of the border and enabling him to monopolize the distribution of meth within the Southwest. Because by allowing a cartel assassination of or attempted hit on a DEA agent, the federales in Mexico and the federal government in the United States both zero in. They have the Eye of Sauron on the cartel operations, preventing any sort of serious movement of goods across the border and persons, giving Gus a large amount of time where he's basically able to dominate the drug empire with impunity. And again, examining Walter White's genius, Walter White understands this. He goes and he basically has a parlay with Gustavo Fring later on. And he shows Gus no animosity regarding the attempted assassination of his own brother-in-law, despite the very clear red lines, which are "you will not hurt family." It seems that if family are sort of collateral for Walter White, he doesn't really care that much. But in this case, there was this sort of mutual sense of admiration from both of them, building up this character relationship. And the reason I say it's the weakest season is because all of this is built up, and then all of this, I believe, is thrown away in the last 2 episodes. But that's just my feeling on this.
Well, before we get to the last 2 episodes, and what I'm going to suggest is, because we're an hour and a half in, we'll kind of end with the end of season 3 for this episode. Maybe do a follow up later, because I feel there's too much good stuff to get into. With that, it would be just too rushed. But I just wanted to comment on a couple of things. The 2 twins that you mentioned as a kind of divine retribution upon Walter. They're the only characters which have any connection to institutional religion or ceremony within the whole series. I was really thinking about this. In most TV series, I think particularly in America, it's quite common to see some kind of church element or Christian element. Think of The Sopranos and the role of the Catholic priest in series 1. But there's really nothing in Breaking Bad apart from these 2 characters who, at the very beginning of season 3, embark on this elaborate ritual where they're crawling through the desert towards this shrine with this skeleton who is standing above this altar, and they put the image of Walter White there. And so there's this, as you say, there's this sense of Walter's done these things. There's reality's going to hit back in a very powerful way, but of course it is subverted. And it's subverted by Gus, as you mentioned. And what I think is particularly special about Gus is, it's been a rather small operation thus far, cooking in the camper van. But Gus has been embarking on this elaborate project where, under one of his businesses, he has built a laboratory using Gale's knowledge, so that this is the perfect place to cook meth. It's the best that Walter could ever want. And he offers Walt $15 million a year to do this. So all of his money troubles will be taken away. But this doesn't convince Walt. What convinces him is when Gus asks him, why did you get involved in the first place? Walt says, I'm doing it for my family, but I feel like through this I'm losing my family for all the reasons that you mentioned. He's hated by his wife. He's losing his son. But Gus says to him, a man provides even if he is kind of not appreciated. He bears it because that is his duty. And that's the thing which really drags Walt back into it.
Well, there's even more sort of going on to compound that feeling, which is why I feel this has lost potential in terms of the relationship between Gus and Walt. Because we talk about this idea that Jesse has been consistently manipulated and maneuvered into doing things which he doesn't even know. And you can say the murder, the accidental death of Jane is the most blatant example of, Walt's manipulation. He's not actually directly responsible for her death, but he is. And as a result of that, everything has changed for Jesse. What happens here is that Gus is performing that on Walter in many ways, because Jesse wants, after his rehab, he wants to break back into the drug business. And with his knowledge, because of course he was an apprentice to the master, and he's able to concoct a formula which is similar to Walt's, to the point where it's basically seen as more or less the same. Of course, Walt's is purer, but as a result of this, Walt takes on a very sort of violent reaction against Jesse, believing that Jesse is robbing him. He's a copycat. And the reason that works so perfect, there's that fantastic scene where he holds up the bag, Jesse's product, and he says, "What the hell is this? This is my product." It perfectly sums up his character, because Walt has a overweening sense of ownership and property, and this is shown with his patents with gray matter, and it's shown again with Jesse. He believes that Jesse is trying to rob him of his own work, of his own creation, and trying to use it for his own ends. Effectively, this is Gretchen and Elliot all over again. Now, Gus Fring understands this. He has observed this because he's wanting to get Walt into that relationship, and he wants to phase Jesse out because he believes that Jesse is a liability because of his drug addiction problem. So he uses this to try and bring Walt in by buying up Jesse's product, implying that Walt could possibly lose that position to Jesse. And of course, it's later proven that Gus had only used that buy as an attempt to get to Walt, exploiting this sense of ownership, this sense of pride over his product, his creation. And that, to me, is the confirmation as to why Walt does this. But then there's another element to it, which is Jesse. How does Jesse get involved in this? Because Walt is introduced to Gale. Gale, who is his own self-made chemist, who has come to this world through different means. I mean, he's basically a scholarship student who is brought into that world through a long system of patronage by Gus. So if anything, it's rather frustrating that Gus has this competition, which is completely beyond his control, and he has to resort to such means to bring him into the system. But Jesse doesn't want this. Jesse is now antagonistic to Walt because Walt can't let things go. He has to rub it in his face that Jesse is being denied this, that all of this was just a means to get Walt in and keep Jesse out. And so Jesse even attacks Walt's car, I think, throws a rock at it and goes off and says, I will continue cooking. At the same time, Hank is onto them. He's onto the RV and he's searching for it. And Walt, again, is trying to prevent, the seizure of the RV. And Jesse believes that Walt is going to steal it. He's basically taking it and selling it off, and he's going to cut him out of it. And by doing so, Jesse brings Hank to the RV with both Walt and Jesse trapped inside of it. And again, using Walt's relationship with Hank is the only way that he could be saved from the situation, in which he calls up Saul, gets his receptionist to pretend to be a nurse and that Marie has been involved in a terrible accident. It gets him away, but at the same time, it destroys Hank because he was just on the cusp of capturing Heisenberg. He's been pulled away because someone knew about Marie and was able to exploit that to try and get him away. He believes that, even though he doesn't know how, he believes that Jesse is responsible for it. He goes to his house and he nearly kills him. So at the same time, you can say that there's this familial conflict for Walt, where two family members effectively are at war with each other. Because Jesse comes out of this, he survives, and says that I'm going to destroy your brother and I'm going to continue cooking. And if anyone stops me, I'm going to give you up. I'm going to give them the great Heisenberg. So all of this convinces Walt even more that the job opportunity being given to him by Gustavo Fring is that perfect means of keeping Jesse in line, keeping him under control, keeping him happy and well paid. Yet at the same time, it saves Hank, because Hank isn't going to be subject to the full retribution of Jesse and, the legal retribution as a result of Saul Goodman. So there are many very competing and nuanced threads which link this manipulation together. Jesse's been manipulated by Walt has been manipulated by Gustavo. I think that's the perfect setup for something that ultimately doesn't pay off in my view. But I just want to announce that is brilliant from my point of view, but it doesn't really go anywhere.
It is quite beautiful in its own way. And I just one aspect I want to touch on is that the relationship between Walt and Gale, because Gale, he's quite I find him an interesting character and sympathetic to a certain extent. He's not somebody who's looking for power of any kind. He just wants to do chemistry, and he has his own kind of loves in life. He enjoys singing songs when you find him at home, or of a certain kind. I think they're from a musical. He's somebody who really delights in the brilliance of Walt. He appreciates Walt's genius and wants to learn from him. And even when Walt tries to berate him, rather than react in an angry manner, rather than retaliate, he takes it on board and he says, "Okay, I'll adapt to what you want." He is the perfect apprentice, but for that very reason, it seems that Walt can't stand his presence, in part because he needs that confrontational dynamic that he has with Jesse, in part because he wants to be seen as superior, he wants to be respected as superior, and in a way, Gale, although he does respect him, it's he as a fellow chemist, he's too close almost to Walt.
Well, I mean, you bring up an interesting point because I've always thought about this. To what extent was the sort of the forced antagonism between them, where Gale is forced out and Jesse is in? Is that a result of Walt's personal disdain as much as it is, Walt's own manipulation and contriving to get Jesse under control and save Hank? And I don't really know. I mean, just thinking about it, the closest sort of character to Gale is almost Elliot. It's almost a reminder that this is a iteration where he has a peer relationship, an intellectual peer who could compete with him. And I do feel, again, like the formula itself, Walt is less concerned with the chemistry than he is concerned with empire, with power. And in many ways, therefore, he can respect Gale as a chemist, as an intellect. And there's that the poem of the learned astronomer, which entices Walt. And of course, Walt then goes on and reads Walt Whitman, say, for example. But that's where the relationship sort of ends for Walt. He doesn't want a partner, a collaborator, even though he claims that Jesse is his 50-50 partner. He needs this apprentice. He needs this person he believes he can control and dominate and will replicate him, as opposed to Gale, who is already his own chemist and already a brilliant chemist in his own right. So I wonder if maybe this was just accidental, but maybe this also reflects partly into why the relationship between Walt and Elliot failed. That, and of course, in the Gretchen angle. But I believe if we're going to look into the Gretchen angle, Gretchen claims that it was all Walt's fault, effectively, that he walked out on her. And his whole sort of believing that there was some great conspiracy, or he was stabbed in the back and Elliot and Gretchen were conspiring to get him out of the company, was his own paranoia and his own egoism. So I do wonder, in the same way that Gale is an innocent, I know it's ironic to think about this, but he is an innocent in this, and he is a victim of Walt. I do wonder to what extent they are parallels. And I just bring that up because I've never seen that point brought up before in any other sort of analysis of this.
Oh, it's an amazing point, and I think it comes even further to fruition with the climax of the season that we've somewhat alluded to. So please jump in if I've missed something. Really what starts the kind of process towards the end of the season is Jesse discovers that Combo was killed by a child who was in the employ of a gang who were distributing for Gus. And so he threatens to kill these gang members who did this. And there's a meeting with Gus and Walt and so on. And Gus essentially forces Jesse to accept the peace, saying, Walt is the only one that wants you alive at this point. If it was up to me, I would just kill you off. But with the condition that the gang members won't use kids anymore. Turns out then the next day that the gang members kill this child. And this drives Jesse mad, and he's going to go and kill these two gang members. Walt finds out about this, knowing that Jesse will probably get himself killed, and saves Jesse by ramming his car into these two gang members and killing them. And so Gus sends his henchmen, Mike Ehrmantraut and Victor, and maybe next time we'll get into Mike because he really develops, I think, after season 3. They're sent to kill Walt, and Walt works out that as long as Gale is alive, Gus can get rid of Walt and Jesse because Gale is somebody who he's maybe not quite as good as Walter, but he's been working with him and he's been learning from him. And so maybe he can replicate what Walt's doing to us very closely. So again, this idea of Elliot taking Walter's patents. Here we've got Gale potentially taking his recipe,
yeah,
and taking the business over. So Walt is being confronted by Mike. He's got a gun to his head. He rings Jesse, tells him to go and kill Gale. Jesse does this, and Gus has to keep Walter and Jesse alive so that he can have his empire. He's made himself essential at this point to Gus's whole operation.
I just want to add a couple of things because, like I said, this is where I feel that this is the weakest point in the series, because everything in season 1 and 2 was so sort of perfectly foreshadowed. Then you get to the episode The Fly. The only sort of frustration really between Walt and Gus at this point has been timing over the exact delivery of the batches and Jesse. So the main contention for Gus is getting rid of Jesse and being able to make this a professional operation in which there is no sort of active liability in the form of Jesse. Just a note on Ehrmantraut. To me, Ehrmantraut is introduced in the last episode in season 2, and he really does seem like some sort of homage to Harvey Keitel's character in Pulp Fiction, the cleaner. But I feel that they liked Jonathan Banks so much that they brought him in to be a more active enforcer in season 3. He starts off as, Saul's cleaner, and by cleaner I mean in the sense of Pulp Fiction, and he later goes on to become Gus's enforcer. And the reason I don't like this ending is because it makes Jonathan Banks, it makes Ehrmantraut look like an idiot, and it makes Gus seem... I also think it retroactively makes season 4 worse as well, because at the summit of their relationship, Gus and Walt, he's invited over to his house. They cook together the Chilean dish, and Gus confides some wisdom into Walt, which is never make the same mistake twice. Going back to their relationship, then we have the episode The Fly, in which Walt almost inexplicably says there can be no more mistakes with these people, otherwise we're dead. And I always felt that this episode was indicative that they didn't really have a clear idea of where season 3 was going to end, and they needed to force some drama, having created this perfect manipulation, which we talked about and have celebrated. That's where the sort of the clean sort of progression of events, the obvious progression of events, where the season basically wrote itself, ended, and they had to insert some drama into the series, which was previously lacking. And so you bring back this idea, which was already set up in season 2, about the death of Combo, and revise it to be that these gang members were associated with Gustavo Fring, which is perfect for Jesse because Jesse has a very clear red line, which is not using children or manipulating or abusing children in any way. So for his character to act like this, it makes sense. For Walt's character to act like this, it makes sense. And indeed, for Walt to try and parlay with Gustavo Fring in the final episode of season 3 makes sense, as does the compromise. You can say that Gustavo Fring is concerned that he could possibly have a opponent, someone who could eclipse him. You can say that this, I'm trying to sort of give it the benefit of the doubt, that Gustavo Fring was actively trying to prevent someone who could ultimately come and eclipse him as he does in season 4. But instead, he focuses on this weird campaign of retribution against Jesse. It's not enough that Jesse is forced out of the operation. And again, even Walt confides this in Gus. It seems like an exercise in futility to go off and kill Jesse. But it's not enough to kill Jesse. You also have to kill Walt. And the only sort of way I can contrive this in my mind is that Gustavo Fring is so offended by the notion that Walt has this split loyalty between Jesse and Gustavo, that he therefore deserves to die, that this is the greatest possible personal affront to him. And to me, it just, on all levels, it weakens the character build-up. It weakens all of the progressive steps and the subtle manipulations, because not only does it seem like a leap in logic, but it also takes certain liberties in terms of making the characters dumber to affect this outcome. because Gus has been so effective in his subtle manipulations, and here he allows Walter to completely sort of obliterate him, to force him into the situation where he knows he's the only living chemist who can keep this operation viable, and killing Gale. And I don't understand why it took such a short amount of time to bring Gale and Walter back together, which was the dream team which Gus always wanted. And Walter even says this at the beginning of season 1, that this is what you always wanted, isn't it? So I don't understand, therefore, the leap in killing Walter, other than to set up season 4, rather than simply saying, now they lived happily ever after. Walt continued cooking up until his death 2 years later. And Gale would continue to sort of honor him in his memory thereafter. The war with the cartel ended successfully for Gustavo Fring, and he happily compensated the family. It does very, very sort of obviously for me. It feels that there has to be a continuity, because as you've set it up from the beginning of the last episode of season 10, unless you intentionally weaken the Gustavo Fring character, you've got a dead end, and you've written yourself into that dead end. And the reason I also brought up the previous point, never make the same mistake twice, he underestimates Walt here, believing he can just effortlessly kill him. And as Walt then brings up in the first episode of season 4, I will not take it. Did you expect me not to take extreme measures to protect myself? He then repeats the same mistake again in season 4, where he underestimates Walt and ultimately lets Walt blow him up, especially when Jonathan Banks Ehrmantraut was conveniently incapacitated for that point. So I just want to hear your thoughts on my sort of overview of the finale of season 3, because I do think it's the weakest point in Breaking Bad, because it does seem forced to me.
I can definitely see your point. To me, the mistake comes earlier from Gus, when they have their initial meeting, and he says that, actually, Walter, you're not like me. You're not a cautious man. You're an impulsive man. And this is revealed by the fact that you have Jesse, who's this junkie, working for you. And he still then goes ahead with moving forward. I know Gale advises him to do so, but to me that's the moment of mistake, because he's already seen that there are these traits within Walt, this impulsiveness which leads to self-destruction, this ability to we mentioned earlier that there's maybe some gamma traits to Walt, this idea that he always wants to be more involved than maybe he needs to be, this desire for power, and sense of entitlement to more involvement. He always wants to have this.
Well, that's the Ehrmantraut accusation. We had a good thing, you idiot. We had Fring. Everything worked like clockwork, and it was you and your ego. I actually completely disagree with that. I think Gus's end was brought on by himself.
I agree.
I agree with you. I mean, but that's an interesting point, and that's why I find it rather frustrating that Gus has serious reservations about bringing Walt into this operation, and he does so through artful manipulation to get Jesse out of the picture, believing he could control him. And it's only once Walt is on that back foot where there is this grudge, which is hanging over him like a sword of Damocles, and yet at the same time he is forced into the relationship with Gale. At the point where Gus seems like he is in a totally powerful position, it's simply a matter of making sure Jesse and Walt never contact one another again. So there isn't that liability left, and there isn't that, you can possibly almost say, backsliding into that relationship. Almost, because again, if you present Walter White with a fait accompli, I've killed Jesse, or I've imprisoned Jesse, or whatever, then there's nothing Walter can do. But at the same time, Jesse wasn't technically family, and he has to think about the number one concern, which is providing for his real family. So I find it therefore odd that you go from that, which could again be a source of conflict, and you take this extra leap, which is, I need to murder Walt as quickly as possible in order to make sure that Gale takes over the lab almost immediately. That doesn't really make any sense. And also, it doesn't make any sense from the point of view that Gus and Mike never try and interrogate the location of Jesse. It's only when, right at the end, where he's about to be killed, does Walt think of the idea, ostensibly, to give him the location of Jesse. And never occurred to Mike. It was Walt's suggestion. So again, I just feel that in order to push this plot point forward, Gus and Mike became idiots conveniently for the last half of the crucial episode in order to enable this very contrived plot outcome to. Because again, from Walt's point of view, it's completely logical what he's doing. He sees that Gale is trying to force the situation. He believes that he's already on the back foot, so he anticipates that the death is coming, and he's completely right. But at the same time, again, like I say, it doesn't make any sense from Gus's point of view, because all Gus has done is create this intolerable situation moving forward into season 4, which ultimately results in his death.
I mean, the only way I think I could justify it is, Gus does have a responsibility of protection to his men. And
and that's where I bring in the first episode of season 4 to sort of confirm my point, which also weakens Mike's character as well and his relationship with Gus. So, I agree with you, but there's that moment, isn't there, where Walt says it's all about me. And it really does seem that the antagonism between Gus and Walt is put front and center to the detriment of the operation, to the detriment of Gus's relationship with his corporation and Mike. And like I said, I feel somehow you could have written this slightly better so it didn't come off as so contrived. But like I said, this is to me the weakest point in Breaking Bad, and I would still recommend wholeheartedly that everyone watch this and try and get over it. But unfortunately, as you can probably tell, I've never been able to get over this.
Oh well, hopefully this has been some level of catharsis for you. We're coming towards the end of the show, so if you're
end of season 3,
sorry, I mean to the Tuesday show.
Oh yes, absolutely. Right. Sorry.
But would you be up for doing a follow-up in the future?
I don't see why not. I mean, there's plenty to talk about regarding. I mean, we already brought up quite a lot of themes, but we can bring up Jonathan Banks's character because there's a lot of his development in season 3 and season 4 and season 5. And season 5 is one of the best series of television. So, and of course, we can talk more into Gus's motivations because we don't really get any of that in season 3. We get the result of his actions, but not the inner sort of motivation, which is in inverse of the Salamanca motto: blood for blood. Blood for blood. Family is everything. And of course, reflecting that back on Walt. But yes, absolutely. And also, perhaps we can discuss Better Call Saul at some point, because we barely also talked about the Saul character by design, because he's got his own dedicated spin-off.
Oh, indeed. That would be excellent. And of course, we'll get to talk about this fella. Yes.
It's all about Huell. Huell Babineau is the key to all of this.
He is literally, as we were discussing. Before we go, we do have one super chat from Ellen Hutter, 1838. Thank you for £10. Thank you very much. Just tuned in. I gave up with The Sopranos after season 3, and Lost never had much payoff after the time investment. People bring up Breaking Bad a lot from my experience. Is it worth watching? What do you think, Walter White?
Well, I could completely contradict everything I've said so far, but I would say it's definitely worth watching. I have a fascination with dark comedies and surreal comedy, and this is a combination. It's a Shakespearean sort of a character drama. It's a thriller and it's a dark comedy all rolled into one. I think that's also why I don't like season 3 as much, because all of those elements retreat in season 3 and they only really come back at the end of season 4. So I think stylistically, in terms of genre as well, that's why I find season 3 the weakest. But regardless, yes, I would recommend sitting through Breaking Bad. As for As for Better Call Saul, that's a more difficult question to answer. Maybe we'll get to that if we have a dedicated episode on that.
Oh, I think we will. I think we will. Regarding Breaking Bad, I would definitely recommend it. For a couple of reasons. I think one, it's just really enjoyable, and if you like good, as AM was saying, if you like good drama, if you like something which deals with human experience and nature in a kind of appropriate way, I think, with this dark comedy thrown in with a bit of a thriller too, it's really good. And I think something which is particularly nice about it is it doesn't seem to be infected by much of contemporary politics.
No, there was a lot of criticism actually about that. If you remember, because this was made before 2015, so there was it's almost like a halcyon age 10 years ago. But there were some criticisms, as with Game of Thrones, that all the protagonists are white and all of the antagonists are Hispanic or black. But apart from that, which is sort of almost quaint, looking back on the state of media criticism, yes, there is very little of that.
I mean, this is the true hero. So, like, how can they complain about that?
I mean, he's the key to everything. I know.
So
you keep thinking we're joking, audience. No, we're actually being entirely sincere. So much so that he becomes as integral in Better Call Saul.
Exactly. And I mean, everybody wants a sequel with him in it as the main character. Better Fuel Heal. Anyway, thank you very much, Ellen, and thank you to everybody who's watching. Thank you, AM/Walter White, for your company. I've thoroughly enjoyed this. I hope you have too. Is there anything that you would like to promote before we head out?
No, just thank you very much for having me on.
You're very welcome. As for myself, I'm going to have a Q&A for members only in either this week or next week at some point. And then next week on the Tuesday show, I have something a bit special planned. So I've been doing a story hour every so often, going through The Princess and the Goblin, reading it through. Next week, I'm going to be joined by probably the best person to do audio readings, Daughter of Albion, and together we are going to do the finale of the book. So I think that will be really good. And otherwise, lots of other things coming up soon. That just leads me to say thank you again for watching, and I'm looking forward to the next edition. Goodbye for now.
Bye-bye.